So welcome back to our lecture series, and we welcome today colleague of the faculty next door, so to speak. So we have not only a keynote speaker today, but also a home speaker of the Faculty of Kulturwissenschaften. I would like to introduce Professor Susanne Lachenicht, who is the chair of the early modern history in the Faculty of Cultural Science. I would like to introduce just a brief, short details about her CV. She studied at the University Paris I, which is Panthéon-Sorbonne in Paris. She changed, so we have a real European scholar actually, switching between different countries. Finished her studies then in Heidelberg with a Magister Artium, and then has done some teachings at the Goethe Institute in Mannheim. Her dissertation was in 2002 at the University of Heidelberg Philosophical Faculty, and it was done in modern history. She was then research assistant in Ireland at the National University of Ireland in Galway for 2 years, and then switched to Potsdam for the Research Center of European Enlightenment, and goes back to Galway then for another 3 years as researcher of the at the Muir Institute in Galway. Back to Heidelberg, she has done some teachings there and has then a scholarship of the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft for a couple of years, and was then going to Paris, to Toulouse as a research fellow at the CNRS in France. She finished her Habilitationsschrift in 2009 at the University of Hamburg, and the title of the work is Hugenotten in Europa und Nordamerika, Immigrationspolitik und Integrationsprozesse in der frühen Neuzeit. So this is one of her research fields she is pursuing over some years. I think the research fields we can name as migration, assimilation, the problem of diaspora, cultural transfer, and nationalism. Just to name a couple of her works, I just mentioned the Habilitationsschrift, which came out in Frankfurt and New York 2010, which is, as what I already said, Hugenotten in Europe and North America. The dissertation was on a French topic, so to speak, the press of the German, what is called Jacobites, Jakobiner, the press of the German Jakobiner in France, and the title is Information und Propaganda. I just name a couple of her essays, English essays. She has as well edited collecting works with the title Religious Refugees in Europe, Asia and North America, which came out at Hamburg 2007. Another work edited is on problem of diaspora, Identities, Exile, Nationalism and Cosmopolitanism in Past and Present, Frankfurt, Chicago 2009. So what I already said, research fields are centered around the problem of transnationalism, identity, assimilation, and so on. And I think we are looking forward to your lecture today, which is on When Nationalism Meets Cosmopolitanism, Ideas, Discourses and Mentalities in the later 19th century. And I think we are all looking forward to your paper.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I hope you can hear me both here in this lecture hall and in Columbia and South Carolina. I am, as Thomas Betzwieser has already indicated, not a researcher on nationalism from one nation-state's perspective, but more interested in the formation of nation our nations and nationhood and identities in a transcultural perspective. And I'm afraid that my talk might go into different directions than some of you might expect in the first place. A keynote on nationalism and cosmopolitanism on the 9th of November can be a bit of a challenge. The 9th of November is not only the day of the November Revolution of 1918. It is best remembered for two very different incidences, turning points in German history: the Reichspogromnacht of 1938 and the fall of the German Wall in 1989. In 1938, the 9th of November heralded Germany's and Europe's way into the Holocaust. It's about the most extreme, the worst impacts that ideologies such as nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism, as developed during the 19th century, could have on humankind. In 1989, however, the 9th of November marked the beginning of a road to, as people would have put it at the time, freedom and democracy for Germans of the GDR. It also marked the development towards a broader understanding of Europe, a more inclusive understanding of the fraternity of European peoples. So the 9th of November is about anti-Semitism and freedom and democracy. Nationalism and cosmopolitanism have often been perceived as exclusive or mutually exclusive ideologies or discourses and practices. Historians looking at specific actors or groups and how they interacted with each other realized that nationalism and cosmopolitanism, both as ideologies and as practices, can be complementary. And this is my starting point for developing a bit how nationalism and cosmopolitanism might have interacted in the 19th century and how Wagner might fit into that picture. To give you the other picture, the other side of the 9th of November. The 19th century has more often than not been identified as the century of nationalism. Nationalism was the ideology at the very heart of the forming European and American nation states. Establishing distinct barriers between nations was and is meant to protect Benedict Anderson's famous imagined communities. They are supposed to protect these communities against other communities that seem to be at odds with one's own community or threaten its very existence. In the 19th and 20th centuries, nations were mostly constructed within a distinct territory. A national group attempted to achieve sovereignty for the nation in order to forge and maintain a distinct culture, language, and sometimes one unifying religion, with one myth about the emergence of the nation, with specific institutions forming the state's government. Those institutions were meant to guarantee the distinctiveness and the economic, political, and cultural survival of the nation. Nationalism as an ideology included specific attitudes, practices, behavior, which excluded those who did not belong to one's own nation. Early 19th century nationalism, especially in Germany, Italy, and Spain, has often been explained as a reaction to aggressive and expansionist elements in French revolutionary nationalism. The latter culminated in the wars of the French Revolution and the French Republican and later Napoleonic invasion of large parts of Europe. In the later 18th century, however, before the outbreak of the French Revolution, nationalism was not at the forefront of ideologies being associated with the German character. As Pauline Kleingeld has persuasively shown, German identity in the later 18th century was defined as cosmopolitan. In his late work, Immanuel Kant described the German character in terms of a cosmopolitan identity. In his Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, Kant writes that the Germans are model cosmopolitans. They are more hospitable towards foreigners than are other peoples. The Germans recognize the merits of other peoples more easily than their own, and they are modest in their dealings with others. They readily learn foreign languages. They emigrate easily, and as cosmopolitans, they are not passionately attached to their fatherland. Germany, Kant writes, quote, is the country of world citizens, and is regarded as such by others. Prior to Kant's positive depiction of cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitans have for a long time been looked upon with suspicion. Starting with the cynic philosopher Diogenes of Sinope, the citizen of the world used to be a very negative figure. Only the Stoics developed a more positive concept, that of a cosmopolitan with moral obligations towards humans anywhere in the world, sharing one common rationality, regardless of their different political, religious, and other particular affiliations. However, cosmopolitans from antiquity to the Enlightenment were more often than not depicted as rootless travelers, without a home or fatherland, without any ties, irresponsible go-betweens with no clear religious, national, or ethnic identity, radical individualists bound to threaten the inner coherence and identity of state, culture, and society. In Immanuel Kant's view, however, cosmopolitanism is a moral attitude, an attitude of recognition, respect, openness, beneficence, and concern towards all other human individuals, cultures, and peoples, an ideal which Kant, with his toward perpetual peace, extended to black and white peoples. One need not actually travel at all to be a citizen of the world, as is famously illustrated by Kant's own biography. Kant spent his entire life in Prussian Königsberg. Furthermore, Kant claims that his cosmopolitan must be a good patriot. His cosmopolitan is not a citizen of nowhere, but a citizen of the world who does belong to one specific nation, who does have special ties with one city or state. Kant was not the sole German philosopher or savant of his time who promoted this variety of the cosmopolitan. Prior to Kant's writing, Christoph Martin Wieland in the 1770s developed in his The Abderites a similar concept of the cosmopolitan. Kant's and Wieland's positive concept of the cosmopolitan was echoed by the early German friends of the French Revolution, such as the circumnavigator Georg Forster, the young Friedrich Schlegel, the young Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and the romantic poet Novalis. The latter drafted a romantic world in which all humans were united in faith and love, while Fichte dreamt, in his early times, of an ideal world federation with cosmopolitan universal rights. Not the least due to the heterogeneous structure of the Holy Roman Empire and German language and culture, stretching far beyond the borders of the Reich, which was in a state of crisis towards the later 18th century, historians have argued that cosmopolitanism was an appropriate ideology for Germans and German culture towards the end of the 18th century. The 19th century inherited from the 18th century both ideologies, cosmopolitanism and nationalism. How did the age of nationalism depict the late Enlightened concept of cosmopolitanism or the cosmopolitan? Was the cosmopolitan as a positive moral figure swept away by the nationalisms of the post-Vienna era? The change from cosmopolitan to nationalist is most prominent, dramatic, and radical in Johann Gottlieb Fichte's work. His idea that the Germans were the cosmopolitan people par excellence, together with the claim that the French had proved themselves unfit to realize cosmopolitan ideals, led to his conviction that the Germans were the most highly developed nation there was. Others started with the latter idea and dropped the cosmopolitan ideal entirely. As Pauline Kleingeld again has put it, quote, before very long, the intellectual landscape had changed so radically that Kant's description of the character of the Germans as cosmopolitans began to sound startling, end of quote. It is evident that if we look at nationalism and cosmopolitanism as ideologies, the two seem to exclude one another. If it comes to practices, narratives, discourses differing from one context to another, the picture, however, becomes more complex and more complicated. During the Vormärz, a period of political turmoil and upheaval, German nationalism and cosmopolitan ideas did not yet become antagonistic. Besides the Wartburg Fest of 1817, the Hambacher Fest of 1832 has been considered one of the milestones on Germany's way towards the revolution of 1848 and the process of state building in Germany. Looking at speeches held at the Hambacher Fest, it becomes evident that the political discourse of the time promoted ideas where nationalisms of diverse peoples and cosmopolitan ideals still went hand in hand. Many addresses promoted the liberation of the Germans, the Poles, the Italians, and the Greek, and the alliance on fraternization of all European peoples. Building the German nation state and one united Europe, united in peace and harmony, the European people supporting each other in liberating themselves from despotism and the tyranny of monarchy and suppression, was at the forefront of the Hambacher Fest of 1832. Johann Jakob Siebenpfeifer, one of the more prominent speakers, concluded his remarks as follows: Es lebe das freie, das einige Deutschland, hoch leben die Polen, der deutschen Verbündete, hoch leben die Franken, so the French, der deutschen Brüder, die unsere Nationalität und Selbstständigkeit achten. Hoch lebe jedes Volk, das seine Ketten bricht und mit uns den Bund der Freiheit schwört. Vaterland, Volkshoheit, Völkerbund hoch. Peoples, however, who did not have a Vaterland or belonged to a nation state were looked upon as cosmopolitan wanderers, suspicious peoples. European Jews in particular were considered as having no Vaterland, as being of no true nation, as the work of Heinrich Luden makes evident. Already in the early decades of the 19th century, cosmopolitan intellectuals and Jews were to be exempt from the German national body and the body of European peoples. Many Hambacher belonged to a generation of early friends of the French Revolution who later in their lives, as Friedrich Gentz, Fichte or Schleiermacher, had turned away from France, as France, in their view, had betrayed the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Some of the early friends of the French Revolution turned into staunch nationalists. German academic and administrative elites, including Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Ernst Moritz Arndt, Josef Goeritz, Friedrich Schleiermacher, and others, forged an imagined community of the Germans which slowly dropped cosmopolitan ideas of the respect of other nations, religions, and ethnicities. Notions of the Germanic or German spirit, der deutsche or deutsche Geist, pure, unspoiled, and superior to all others, especially the French, developed in the writings of those men. German language and culture, unfolding from the Middle Ages, started preoccupying German academics such as Karl Lachmann, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, and Friedrich von Raumer, and helped forge an ideology of German Volkstum and Volkskultur. Especially German universities, through the Burschenschaften, were at the forefront of forging one German imagined community. France's plans to expand into the German-speaking Rhine area in 1840-41 sparked an anti-French mass movement in Germany, where people of various social strata started endorsing the nationalist and anti-French ideas of German intellectual elites. Denmark's attempts in 1846 to fully incorporate the Duchy of Schleswig into Danish territory was a hard blow for German nationalists. That even a small country such as Denmark could challenge the German nation, could challenge it because it was not protected by a powerful and united German nation state, caused scandal, rage, and indignation. In the mid-19th century, German nationalism, even if no longer a phenomenon restricted to German Protestant intellectual elites, was not a mass phenomenon, however, and did not comprise millions of Germans. However, the media chose to spread its ideology, so music, especially nationalist songs that were sung in lower middle-class associations, such as the Sing- und Turnvereine, pamphlets and newspapers helped spread nationalist ideology within Germany. Research on German nationalism promotes the idea that up to the foundation of the Deutsche Reich in 1871, nationalism in Germany could have been identified as patriotism, as a more tolerant form of nationalism. From 1870 on, the story goes, German nationalism, as Fritz Stern and Otto Dann put it, started taking on chauvinistic, anti-Semitic, imperialist, and racist overtones. From the 1870s, liberal nationalism, the story goes again, turned into radical nationalism. Christian Jansen and Henning Borgrefe opt for a more differentiated view of nationalism and hold that any form of nationalism can turn into a xenophobic, imperialist, racist, and anti-Semitic ideology. It is true, though, that nationalism was attributed a different role in the Kaiserreich after 1871. It became the very ideology which did support and legitimize German government policies. Anti-Semitism became as much more important as racist ideologies justifying Germany's imperialist policies in Africa and the Pacific. Nationalism, with xenophobic and anti-Semitic overtones growing more prominent, was not the one and sole ideology in mid-19th century Germany. Liberalism, nationalist and cosmopolitan liberalism, inheriting much from the period of the Enlightenment, developed as much as early socialist and communist ideas and ideologies. Its most prominent figures would become Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, being as much as later the Social Democrats defined as Vaterlandslose Gesellen, as they promoted an international and cosmopolitan society of human beings, as the Communist Manifesto should have led humanity as a whole, or not as distinct peoples, into classless and nationless global society. From the mid-19th century, cosmopolitans again turned into a suspicious breed. This becomes not only evident in the German Empire, but also in Tsarist Russia, and later from 1917 in the Soviet Union, where anti-Semitism and anti-cosmopolitanism went hand in hand. Jewish subjects of Tsarist Russia and Jewish citizens of the Soviet Union were defamed as cosmopolitans, that is, as anti-patriotic and as inimical to the Russian and later Soviet state. Anti-cosmopolitanism in the 20th century served as a powerful ideology to justify persecution and finally the elimination of entire groups and peoples. Cosmopolitanism in the later 19th century clearly was no accepted ideology. However, we can identify cosmopolitan practices and discourses that in the first place seem to be at odds with the prevalent nationalist and anti-Semitic discourses. Cosmopolitan practices and discourses are often crucial for the economic and political survival of individuals or specific groups, such as artists, actors and actresses, artisans and others. Cosmopolitan practices, the ability to learn foreign languages and to easily move between one or two or more cultures, acting as brokers of transculturation, are at the very heart of professional networks providing cultural transfer and cultural exchange. Cosmopolitanism, they're borrowing from other nations' literatures, music and theatre, are also at the very heart of forging distinct national cultures. Cosmopolitan attitudes and practices often coexist with nationalisms and discourses of national exclusiveness. Furthermore, situations of exile of individual wanderers might enhance and promote feelings of uprootedness and the need to redefine one's own identity. Situations of errand might entail a stronger consciousness of national identity, an increasing desire to protect and safeguard this identity and to relocate it in a distinct territory. So, how does this all relate to Richard Wagner? And I have to confess, I'm no specialist of Richard Wagner at all, so trying to put him into the picture is a bit of, well, an experience, and I'm interested to know what you think about it. Born in 1813, the year when Prussia declared war on Napoleon, Wagner grew into a political atmosphere where Metternich and the Deutsche Bund, so the German Confederation, blocked most nationalist and liberal movements within the territories of the German Confederation. In 1819, the Karlsbader Beschlüsse, and I couldn't help putting in this very famous picture, banned student associations, the Burschenschaften, which were promoting nationalist and liberal ideas in most radical ways. Being Deutsch-national at the time meant that a person did belong to a cultural and social vanguard. Richard Wagner did belong to this group from his early youth onwards. He would join the Corps Saxonia Leipzig, which, for his liking, proved not Deutsch-national enough. While being part of a vanguard nationalist movement in Germany, Wagner's biography reveals many elements which clearly identify him as a cosmopolitan, as a rootless and sometimes ruthless traveler, a go-between of various cultures with a more or less clear religious, national, and ethnic identity. Moving from Leipzig to Magdeburg, then to Königsberg, which he had to leave following his bankruptcy as director of the local theatre, Riga became Wagner's next station. From there he moved to London in 1839, fearing legal prosecution in Riga. He spent the years 1840 and 41 in Paris, where he was deeply impressed by the German Jewish composer Giacomo Meyerbeer. In 1842, Wagner was able to move back to Germany, to Dresden, where between 1842 and 1849 he acted as director of music for the court's opera house. After having participated in the Dresden riots of 1849, Wagner had to flee from Saxony and moved to Zurich, from where he went prior to 1858 for shorter visits to Paris, Bordeaux, and various Italian towns. Between 1858 and 1866, Wagner was constantly on the move, traveling between Paris, Brussels, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Budapest, Prague, and various other destinations. His life became less mobile when in 1864 Louis of Bavaria offered to become Wagner's patron and enabled him and his family to settle in Munich. However, already in 1866, Wagner moved again to Switzerland, this time to Triebschen near Luzern. The most stable period of his life was, and this does not surprise people here, was his time in Bayreuth, where he stayed most of the time from 1872 to 1883. While this abbreviated itinerary does not make Wagner a cosmopolitan sui generis, the impact of those places, peoples, and cultures on Wagner's work certainly did. It is stunning to watch Wagner successfully reshape German national culture, both through his operas and his writings, starting in 1840. As Nicholas Vajani has put it, quote, Wagner self-fashioning, as most German of the Germans begins here in Paris, where Germanness is no longer coupled with Philistinism and where ultimately the province becomes the virtuous and wholesome antidote to the corrupt and decadent metropolis. Thanks for that quotation, Nicholas. This seems to echo the sentiments of Fichte, Arndt, and others shared at the beginning of the 19th century. Wagner's theories, the narratives he creates about German national music, are a strange blend of cosmopolitan eclecticism and nationalist elements. On the one hand, he concedes that the German genius copies from other foreign traditions in music and literature. On the other hand, Wagner opts for the purity of the German elements in German music. At the latest, from his Zurich exile in 1849 onwards, his post-1848 exile seems to have fostered Wagner's need to contribute to the making of a new national German culture. Now, at the very latest, his cosmopolitanism turned into what I would dub cosmopolitan nationalism, despising of everything that was not truly German. Still, Wagner had no difficulties in choosing various elements of other cultures in order to create a distinct German culture and cult, superior to all other cultures. Integrating French, Jewish, English, Russian, and Italian elements into his operas and writings, Wagner without any difficulty, claimed them for German culture. Through his magic hands, they became German. From a postmodern perspective, shaping a new national culture with the help of foreign elements is typical of any forging of an imagined community. Or, to put it differently, from a postmodern perspective, all national cultures are but a blend of foreign and not so foreign elements and influences borrowed from the other and then assimilated into the concept of one's own national culture. Once Wagner and some of his compatriots had assimilated elements of non-German foreign cultures into their own national culture, they more often than not despised of these very cultures they had learned and even copied from. A good and early example of borrowing from and then assimilating the borrowed into one's own national culture are the fairy tales of the Gebrüder Grimm. Collected in the north of Hesse, where Huguenots had settled from 1685 onwards, those Deutsche Märchen are more French than German, if at all German. It could be mind-boggling that those nationalists of the 19th century did not seem to see the inherent dichotomy and contradictions in their doing. However, in doing what they did, Wagner and his compatriots clearly were imitating and further promoting typical discourses of their time. They were the vanguard of what I would term cosmopolitan nationalists. I would like to remind us of a few well-known examples of this cosmopolitan nationalism, and I'm sure that the specialists on Wagner would know many more examples than I do. So the process of amalgamating foreign and German elements and then turning them into the new German national culture and cult, taking firstly the example of Wagner's concept of Zukunftsmusik. Matthias Brzoska has shown how Wagner in the 1840s readily adopted the French concept of musique de l'avenir, a concept developed by French neo-Catholic movement of the 1830s and by the early socialists, how he adopted this concept. Then Wagner distanced himself from the French and socialist origins of this concept when trying to integrate Tannhäuser into the concept of the Grand Opéra in Paris. And then, again, already in 1861, Wagner readapted and transformed the concept of musique de l'avenir and made it part of his brand already by his writing in 1861 with the name Zukunftsmusik. And I'm sure the musicologists will know more about the entire process than I do, but I found that quite intriguing how he more or less copies or borrows from others, then says, oh, this is nothing I can really accept, and then makes it his own. And I think it's not only typical for Wagner at the time, but also for many other nationalist cultures in other countries in Europe as well. The second example, and this is not the right ticket I have here, but it's the only one I could find, is Wagner's Tannhäuser. In Kontinuität und Entwicklung, Wagners Tannhäuser und seine Metamorphosen, Sieghart Döring has persuasively shown how Wagner between 1859 and 1861 adapted the Tannhäuser for his Paris audience and made it into a more grand opera thing. His attempts to satisfy what was he thought to be his Parisian public's taste led, as Sieghart Döring has shown, to cutting out too many scenes of the drama that made it incomprehensible for his audience. Wagner fell victim of what research on cultural transfer has dubbed cultural misunderstandings. However, many elements of the Parisian version of Tannhäuser, including many elements which should have pleased the Paris audience, were not eliminated when Wagner again adapted Tannhäuser for his Munich in 1867 and then Vienna in 1875 audience, and thus turned the Tannhäuser into a truly German masterpiece with many French elements in it. Thirdly, Tristan. Premiered in 1865, Wagner adapts with Tristan and Isolde not only an Irish legend, but also incorporates much of Schopenhauer's borrowing from Indian Buddhism and Brahmanism. Sorry? Not yet. There's none. So he turns an Irish, Indian, Buddhist, Brahmanist work into a purely Germanic opera, which Tristan still is up to the very day, and nobody bothers at the time, which I find rather surprising. I'm not, as I said, the specialist to identify all foreign elements in Wagner's work. The influence non-German and non-Germanic ideas, legends, music, and images had on his work are maybe best summed up in the words of Gerhard Hauptmann. Ich bin weit davon entfernt, mich an Wagner deutschtümelnd zu entzücken, denn er ist ebenso griechisch wie deutsch, ebenso asiatisch wie europäisch. Ein Werk wie der Ring ist, was Ursprung, Wachstum und Vollendung angelangt, das einzige seiner Art in der Welt und vielleicht das rätselhafteste Kunstgebilde der letzten Jahrtausende. It has often been held that Wagner's enthusiasm for Giacomo Meyerbeer in Paris turned into anti-Semitic sentiments due to Meyerbeer's scheming and the consequent failure of Tannhäuser in Paris. Sieghart Döring again has shown that Meyerbeer never actually had a hand in the Tannhäuser debacle. Richard Wagner must have been aware of the true reasons behind the flop. Why then did Wagner turn from an enthusiastic admirer of Meyerbeer, who inspired much of his early and later work, as his 1841 essay über Meyerbeers Hugenotten shows? Why did he turn not only into Meyerbeer's personal enemy, but into an anti-Semite of the worst kind? Why did Wagner promote an anti-Semitic ideology while simultaneously entertaining excellent personal contacts with many Jewish writers, artists, and publishers of his time, such as Karl Tausig or Joseph Rubinstein? It has often been argued that Wagner's complex relationship with Meyerbeer was at the very heart of his first admiring, then rejecting Meyerbeer, and of producing Wagner's most controversial anti-Semitic writing published in 1850, first anonymously and then under his name in 1869, Das Judentum in der Musik. Looking at how Meyerbeer impacted on Wagner's work, it is all the more unsettling to find the following sentence in Das Judentum in der Musik. Ob der Verfall unserer Kultur durch eine gewaltsame Auswerfung des zersetzenden fremden Elements aufgehalten werden könne, vermag ich nicht zu beurteilen, weil hierzu Kräfte gehören müssten, deren Vorhandensein mir unbekannt ist. Psychologizing interpretations of Wagner's 1850 following attitude towards Meyerbeer and Jewish artists in general do not really provide satisfying answers. I would argue, again following Nicholas Vajoni, that firstly, anti-Semitism became an element of the brand Richard Wagner. Again, with his biological anti-Semitism, Wagner made himself part of a vanguard of anti-Semitic trends in 19th century Germany. Secondly, I would add that borrowing from, copying, and then assimilating foreign cultural elements into constructions of one's own national cultures, while simultaneously despising of those very cultures one had copied from, was typical of late 19th century cosmopolitan nationalism. A thesis that might be tested for other, not only German writers and musicians. Cosmopolitan nationalism would then, to put it into a moral jacket, have consisted of poaching other cultures in order to assimilate some of the elements into one's own culture, while simultaneously sneering at the prize. Wagner then would have simply copied typical discourses and mentalities of his time, typical of the ways in which national cultures, imagined communities of the late 19th century had to be constructed. Looking at other proponents, not only of German, but also of French, Italian, Norwegian, British, and Irish national cultures in the later 19th century, Wagner's attitude becomes less of a personal case than typical practices and discourses of this time. And I think this thesis might have to be tested. Wagner's biography, his operas and writings are typical of the ways cosmopolitanism and nationalism intertwine in the later 19th century. The 19th century, or the later 19th century, produced a cosmopolitan of a different kind, a go-between of various cultures with strong ties to one's own fatherland, incorporating elements of foreign cultures into one's own national culture. This concept of the cosmopolitan is far from the Stoics' concept, which would have included the recognition and moral obligation towards other cultures and peoples. It is also different from the Cynics' concept and, of course, from Kant's definition of the cosmopolitan. Wagner's biography, as much as many of his contemporaries, I would claim, make evident that we would gain a better understanding of the rise and fall of nationalisms and cosmopolitanism and its effects on societies, cultures, economies, and politics if we looked at them not as mutually exclusive, but as complementary elements. Research on nationalism has often identified nationalism as the ideology fostering exile and cosmopolitan attitudes of those who are exiled. This is certainly true. However, cosmopolitan attitudes and practices can also foster nationalism and the construction of exclusive national cultures, a pattern which is perfectly illustrated by Wagner's biography and work, and I think many of his contemporaries. The relationship of cosmopolitanism and nationalism is more complex than sociological and historical research, and theories on nationalism have had it. Looking at case studies, such as Wagner, case studies that might be very typical of the ideologies, discourses, practices, and mentalities of the time, might be useful to make us understand the complex and complicated webs of belonging and not belonging. And I took Anne Mungen's invitation to give a talk on nationalism and cosmopolitanism as an invitation to engage or to further engage with, I think, disciplines that might have been excluded from theories of nationalism, cosmopolitanism. So I think it might be worth looking at how national cultures like German literature, German music were shaped in order to contribute to better understanding how nationalism inflicts problems on peoples. And I hope we're going on from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne Lachenicht, for this highly illuminating and enlightening paper on nationalism, and in particular, I think very interesting, the roots of the idea of cosmopolitanism in late 18th century. I think we will invite maybe today more the students into the discussion, so I'm not quite sure how we should proceed. Nicholas, should we start here?
I think we have a question over here, if that's okay.
Then start, please.
Okay. Zoom in on the Hannah.
Should I take that microphone?
Yeah, I think that microphone, it's all working.
I had a question about the budding nationalist movement in the 18th century. Would the cultural achievements of the Jewish community at the time would they have been included in the newly forming German identity? I.e., was there a nationalist movement apart from anti-Semitism in the 18th century, which later the two fused?
If I got your question right, because there was a bit of a noise in the background. Actually, there was. I mean, I've tried to describe the strand that would mostly be identified with Wagner's brand of nationalism, but there are more liberal forms of nationalism where the Jewish population of the German-speaking parts of Europe would have been included, and where Jewish artists and authors, politicians would also make claims to being included. But we all know that this attempt at a more liberal and less anti-Semitic concept of nationalism failed in the end. The thing is, you cannot really distinguish in a satisfying way between anti-Semitic and non-anti-Semitic nationalism. Most nationalists in the 19th century actually did have at least anti-Semitic undertones or overtones, as I would put it. So it's on the one hand, we have the efforts to include the Jews, especially in the process of the emancipation of Jews in the German-speaking parts of Europe. On the other hand, there are always tendencies throughout the 19th century and already in the late 18th century to exclude them. So we know the outcome, but this doesn't mean there have not been any such attempts at all.
Can I just add, Susanne? Something that comes to mind immediately is Lessing's play Nathan der Weise, which, if I remember correctly, is somewhere around 1780 or so. In any case, that is a play that tries to not only preach religious tolerance, but really the integration of the Jews and the significance of Jews in an international community.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, there are authors, philosophers who try to not only opt, as you say, for religious tolerance, but who really try to integrate, maybe not assimilate Jews into German society. But as I said, I think these attempts are much more rare than the attempts of excluding the Jewish population.
Okay, Niklas, can we switch to the audience here? So are there any questions in the audience here in Bayreuth? Yeah.
I would say there is a lot of cosmopolitanism, especially in music in the time before Wagner. Handel and Haydn were international well-known composers in the 18th century in England and in France, even Haydn, and then Beethoven, whose Missa Solemnis was performed in St. Petersburg even, and then of course Wagner's great anti-poet, the man against whom Wagner himself wrote his writings, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, who traveled to Italy and England, where his Elias oratorio was performed.
Is this aus? You're absolutely right, but I would claim that there's a lot of cosmopolitanism in Wagner's work as well. And what is striking about his work is that his nationalism does not stop people all over Europe from admiring his work, even though it's clearly anti-French. I think one of the largest communities of admirers of Wagner's operas would be fin de siècle of France. So what I find interesting, I think the finger has not really been put onto it, is how cosmopolitan Wagner is while simultaneously being a staunch nationalist, and how this fits without any problems into the picture of his time, not only in Germany, but also in France and in various other countries. I think that is really striking. Music is cosmopolitan. I would claim any kind of national culture has cosmopolitan elements in it. The question is whether you identify them as such, or whether you just say this is not true because it doesn't fit into your nationalist ideology. And I think it's fascinating to see how cosmopolitan elements, the cosmopolitan reception of Wagner's work at the time, fits perfectly into the nationalist claims he and his contemporaries make. And I think it's this very, to my mind, irrational ideology which is so difficult to disentangle and which is so difficult to deal with.
Can I join in the conversation here? Would that be okay? I just wanted to say what I really liked about Susanna's talk is her attempt to negotiate between these two ideas and precisely not to argue that they are mutually exclusive. And I think it's very difficult to separate them on many occasions. I wanted to add that in the 18th century, we of course also have the beginnings of very distinct nationalist rhetoric. Also in terms of music criticism, there was the attempt to try and define a German musical idiom which was harmonically more complex and richer than the French and Italian idiom, which was more melodic and thus more superficial. So we also have that. So in addition to the Haydn and the Handel examples, we also have, for instance, Johann Sebastian Bach, who was held up as being the ideal of German music, even though Bach is someone who borrows heavily from Italian and French and even English musical idioms. So it's incredibly complicated, and I think that's one of the strengths of your talk, Susanne. I wanted to add one more thing, and that's about Wagner. You're absolutely right. He was cosmopolitan in terms of his life, and one way of reading The Flying Dutchman, which is an opera he worked on from 1841, 1842, is that it's a depiction of the wandering Jew Ahasuer, but in a sense also a depiction of his own fate, so to speak. So one way of looking at Wagner's anti-Semitism is that it also has an element of self-loathing and self-criticism as part of it. So this is not really a question, it's just a comment on your talk.
Okay.
Very much for the comment. I just wanted to stress, I mean, I didn't want to get too much into the early modern part of the talk. I mean, having started in the late 18th century, I thought I might have already stretched or tried to connect 2 centuries. Obviously, nationalism and nationalist ideas are already part of any kind of music and theatre and literature in the 16th, 17th and 18th century. You will find anti-national stereotypes of the same kind. We find them today already in 14th and 15th century Spanish texts, for example. So it's absolutely clear that we can't speak of the 18th century as being the cosmopolitan century and the 19th century as the nationalist or national century. So I think what you pointed out is exactly that we have already a very complicated relationship of cosmopolitanism and nationalism in the 18th century, and even just in the centuries earlier than that. But I didn't want to dwell on this because I think the talk would have become much too long.
Okay, thanks. And any other questions in the audience here? Oh, yes. So you get a microphone.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you, you spoke of the music of future, but I think it's also important to regard the political scriptures of Wagner and his idea of the man of future. And in this regard, he has a kind of cosmopolitan utopia, I would say, that we have to go through nationalism, okay, but the precondition is high individualization in modern society. And then he writes in several places about how to overcome then individualism again, together with nationalism, and to build free groupings, especially, of course, in the artistic field, which are able to show us the real freedom of mankind. Like in in physics or so, how in the chaos structures are grouping themselves and then solving them again. And this is an utopia discussion which Kafka and other Jews joined into. And for example, the German mythology in The Ring, there is no German Reich, no German, everything is declining. I mean, the hero is declining, the gods are declining. I'm always wondering how one could adapt this as a positive myth for Nazi Deutschland. But I think this type of interest of Wagner, where he included the Jews and said the Jews come out of a tradition which was much narrower than ours, and they couldn't develop individually to create arts than we do, because they were not individualized in the same sense. This developed later on in cosmopolitan reality, but not at that time yet. And but he proposed the Jews to get out of the tradition, as far as Germans had to get out one day out of their too strong traditions and dogmas, etc. And religion had to get out of the dogmas. So there was a string of thinking where he developed an idea of future for both of them.
Absolutely right about the cosmopolitan elements in The Ring, and I think I've just put back the famous quote of Gerhard Hauptmann, peoples of his time have been pretty much aware of it. The unsettling thing about Wagner, and I wouldn't say it's about Wagner alone, but about many people writing or being at the forefront of forging national cultures, is how these ideas are intermingled. I mean, Wagner, as you said, has been deeply influenced by utopian socialism, and it's not a linear process that he moves from utopian socialism to nationalism and then again to cosmopolitanism with The Ring. It's coexisting with each other all the time, and it's mutually influencing each other, and it makes it so hard to really nail him down and nail not only him but the entire ideologists of the time and say what they're really about. I mean, these, what I would term irrational ideologies, makes it very easy for people to pick out something and to develop on it while simultaneously neglecting what's also in the picture. But I think our job would be to really look at the process of nation building, and not from a sociologist or historians or a political scientist perspective, but to really have a closer look of how people like Wagner and others shaped national cultures and how this impacted again on national politics of the time and of later times. And I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done there. Less, I would say, from the musicologists or literature people's point of view, but from people who are more about systemizing things. So, as I said, sociologists, political scientists, historians, to take this on board when we reflect on nationalist ideologies or cosmopolitan behavior.
Could I interject here just for a second?
Yes.
I just wanted to say, I think one of the problems is that we look at nationalism through the lens of the Holocaust and the Third Reich. So nationalism has become something toxic from our point of view. And it's very hard to look at nationalism within the context of the 19th century. And I think one of the points you make, Susanne, indirectly, is that nationalism is also supposed to be a progressive, liberatory move. Both cosmopolitanism and nationalism are ways of somehow recovering from the Middle Ages and from feudalism and figuring out a way to proceed in the wake of the French Revolution. And they are not inherently evil or bad. It's a question of what developed in the course of history, especially in the 20th century. And I think when we talk about Wagner and nationalism, we need to keep that in mind.
Comment, I think you're absolutely right, and I would even push things further than that, being strictly speaking early modernist. There are people who are specialists of the 19th and 20th century who would claim there is no such thing as nationalism before the French Revolution, and I would say clearly no. There is nationalism, even though it's different in its, the way it's being shaped in the early modern period and even in the Middle Ages. And I think this makes things even more complicated. But I think the problem we often have is, and you're absolutely right, as that we look at things, at phenomena that are typical of their time, always through the lens of the 20th and the 21st century. And this spoils more or less our understanding of how ideologies and behaviors and practices really worked at the time. It's hard to take off the lenses. We are born with them, but it might be worth trying.
Okay, thank you very much. Anno Mongen first, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for a really very, very interesting paper, especially since we are looking onto more or less well-known facts in our discipline from a very specialist perspective from another angle, and I think that's actually very, very interesting and very stimulating. I just wanted to react to your idea for research, so to speak, and I think it also relates to the last discussion, because I think the problem is not that there is no research done or no work done like on nationalism or cosmopolitanism through art history or like music history or literature history, but the preconditions are wrong, because it's the idea is that the 19th century worked as a national century, and I think that is, to my understanding, the problem. And looking at Wagner as more as the common case, as you did, I think is very, very interesting in that regard, which would shift also our perspective and thinking on Wagner.
Of literature or musical studies on the time is often that you have a case and then you integrate the case into the context of the time. And it's exactly what you described, what's going to happen. So you take up what's been said, like the mainstream ideas about a certain time or period, and then you integrate it into it instead of switching things around and looking at the specific case and looking at how much does this say about the period and the time this person is located in. And I think that would be a bit more enriching if we tried it just the other way around. And I mean, to make a bit, or to advertise a bit what we are planning to do here in Bayreuth is actually to reintegrate with our new field, so integrating the two faculties and integrating the knowledge we have here in Bayreuth and elsewhere in order to get more differentiated answers on processes of nation building, of the building of national cultures, and to really feed into this postmodern discussion that national cultures are but a blend of various elements. And that it's sometimes from a 21st century and postmodern perspective rather ridiculous to think of Tristan, for example, as a Germanic opera. I mean, it's Celts, not Germanic peoples, so, well.
Okay, Thomas Pagatsky, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I would like to, you can understand me? Yes. Right, okay. To get to the point of Professor Vasonnier, what you just mentioned, that we shouldn't look at nationalism so only through the lens of the 20th century, but we have to situate it in the conditions of the 19th century. So, and let's not forget, for example, that Marxism, Leninism made nationalism an integral part of the formation of the future socialist state. Stalin himself has written that there is a long way to go to a classless society, and the necessary stepping stone in between is nationalism, the formation of nations. So, you mentioned correctly that there is a big impact on Wagner of utopian socialism, Bukharin, for example. What I would like to know is anyone here in this room who could point me to the, a direct link between Wagner and Marx. I know that Karl Marx did make some deprecatory references to Wagner, whom he didn't particularly like, but is there vice versa any evidence of that Wagner had any knowledge or had any impact or did read Marx? Thank you. So there's a socialist connection.
Yeah.
And I'm going to elaborate on this in my contribution in January.
Having got through some of the literature on the political writings of Wagner, I think I found something, but I couldn't quote it right now. So I will look it up again, and once I find the quotation or like the link, I would pass it on.
By all means, that would make me happy. Right?
Yes. Nothing better than making colleagues happy. Excellent.
Can I just add, I don't know if this really answers your question, but Wagner uses the word communism in, I think, Art and Revolution, if I'm remembering correctly, but he's not referring to Marx in particular.
Okay, thank you, Niklas. I think next question is Wolf-Dieter Ernst.
Yeah, thank you, Susanne, for this talk. And I was just about to leave, but now I have a question, which I can't left unspoken, so to say. And it's leading towards my talk, which is covering more the aesthetics of Wagner in the post-dramatic or contemporary theater scene. But as we have figured out that we kind of try to link those two faculties. So this is one question from faculty 4 to faculty 5. Does cosmopolitanism have or could be depicted in an image, whereas nationalism does, surely? We know what is German. when we look at a stage set.
Images and stereotypes about nationalism,
it's a question
in
on representation.
Personified nationalism.
How do you, in what kind of visual representation or musical representation figures could you think of your idea of cosmopolitanism?
You mean just spontaneously?
In the 19th century.
In the 19th century. I think one of the images you would have in mind is any kind of image relating to Nathan der Weise, where you would have the three religions personified talking to each other. I think that would be a typical depiction of cosmopolitanism from a late 18th century perspective. As I said, the positive image of cosmopolitanism and the image meaning also how you aesthetically try to describe or to paint cosmopolitanism gets lost in the 19th century, and then we do no longer have these positive depictions or images, aesthetically transformed of cosmopolitanism. I think this is very speaking. I mean, what's interesting about the entire talk of cosmopolitanism today, people think this is an ideal and it's always been. Not quite. Cosmopolitanism, as I tried to point out in the first place, has more often and for long periods of human life been depicted as something very negative, and it's only the late Enlightenment and the post-war, post-modern era where cosmopolitanism, I think in the sense of, as Kant would have put it, is a positive thing. So I think images are rare.
Can I just add something here? I think this is a brilliant question from Wolf-Dieter Ernst, because it's precisely the nation has a sound, it has a flag, it has a currency, it has a language, it has all kinds of images and sounds that are associated with it, and there really is nothing comparable that can represent cosmopolitanism. I would venture to say the iPhone is a representation of cosmopolitanism, but you have to be in the late 20th century to get there.
Can I add a question on this issue of cosmopolitanism at the end of 18th century? I'm not quite clear about the historical background, actually. Where are the roots for this idea in Germany? Is it the French Revolution? Is it the German political situation of so-called Kleinstaaterei? Or where can be rooted this idea of cosmopolitanism? And the second question is, I think you have demonstrated how the further development of this idea is in the 19th century. My question is, where do you see maybe we can say the Sündenfall of nationalism in the negative side? At which point does come in these anti-features, these exclusive features actually, before 1871, I think, and there must be a lot before 1871.
Well, the thing is, you are tackling more or less the limits of my being a historian, because you want a clear chronological answer. And the trouble is there is none. Nationalism has always been, or has always incorporated anti-elements. Wherever you meet it, in which forms it ever taken, it's always been there that it's anti. On the other hand, nationalism and the construction of national cultures have always had a cosmopolitan precondition, because you construct a national culture from cosmopolitan practices. So I think there is, it's a perpetual tension between, and I would always say, cosmopolitan practices and nationalist or national ideas or ideologies, which is also a quite interesting distinction to make between those two phenomena. It's the late Enlightenment, where especially German philosophers and writers develop an idea of cosmopolitanism being a positive ideology, and where it becomes highly inclusive. As I said, it also includes from the late 1780s, early 1790s in Kant's writing, even black peoples, which is really very exciting for the time. This, however, does not mean that even the same people like Wieland had also nationalist ideas, despite his supporting or even having earlier ideas that Kant would develop later. So I think there is no linear process and there is no date or year where things break down. I mean, the French Revolution and the wars, the Napoleonic Wars, have often been considered a watershed, pointing Germans more towards an anti-French and then anti-everything nationalism. If you look at 17th and 18th century writings and include them into the entire picture, I would say it's a typical divide between early modern and modern historians, which has nothing to do with historical realities.
For art, for an abstract art as music, it's in particular difficult to that what Nicolas said, there is a national sound actually in music and in instrumental music. So there is this famous remark by Haydn saying, I'm going now to London because my music is understood all over the world, or is understood everywhere. Yeah, we can understood. But that does not actually mean the reading of German instrumental music is now understood all over the world. So this is our reading of this famous quote. So it's quite difficult, and maybe we can come back to the problem of cultural transfer in regard to opera. So I have Sylvia Meyer on my list.
Thank you very much. I would like to participate in the last parts of the discussion. First of all, representations of cosmopolitanism in the 19th century from a literary perspective or literary scholar's perspective. That would, of course, be the traveler, the 19th century traveler. You have it in painting, you have it in literature. I would also like to challenge our very positive concept of cosmopolitanism that we've just put forward so much. Right now there is a big debate about the term and the concept. If you think of Martha Nussbaum's, the philosopher's writings on cosmopolitanism, which I like, which I find very interesting, these have been extremely challenged, for example, by people who take a class-based analysis or by neo-Marxists, because cosmopolitanism, and I think also sometimes in the way you used it today, very much refers to a concept that privileges the middle class or the privileged. And there are nowadays concepts that try to actually replace even the concept, because it's so much linked to a privileged position. And that would complicate or trouble, I think, the discussion of Wagner even further. What you wonderfully pointed out is that you called it the cosmopolitan elements in his work, in his writing, in his music. I tend to call this a kind of hybrid quality. But of course we do need terms like nationalism, cosmopolitanism to make a point. But I think we can even go much further to trouble the whole thing. The question is, how useful is that? Right, but when it comes to cosmopolitanism, we should bear in mind that it's not an unchallenged concept nowadays.
Well, I would absolutely subscribe to what you're saying, and if the message was cosmopolitan is great, nationalism is not, that was not the intention of my talk. It's just that what I wanted to point out is that cosmopolitanism has for a long time been something very negative, which doesn't mean that because we look at it as something positive today, we are right. Cosmopolitanism, as you indicate, can as much be of an exclusive ideology as nationalism can be on the class level, but also if it comes to groups, cultures that might feel threatened by global cosmopolitanism. So I think we have to be careful with both ideologies, if they come as ideologies. And I think my purpose would be to really have very close and closer looks at how they complement each other and what the effects are in different times and in different cultures in order to understand why things developed the way they did.
Okay, Anne Mongen.
Yeah, I'm also very happy for the question Wolf asked, because I think we do have, of course, also especially a musical example for cosmopolitanism, and that is, I think, of course, Richard Wagner's Rienzi, and that's why I'm glad that he brought up that question, because Rienzi has not been mentioned yet. It's interesting that, of course, here also something else comes into play, which also hasn't been mentioned yet. That's the fact that there's also a lot of Italian elements in there. So the French-German connection, we have been talking about a lot today, but this is also, of course, I think very basic here. And of course, then the operas of Meyerbeer are in the same way cosmopolitan, or that's the model for that opera. And of course, Meyerbeer is a German. You know, that is so interesting at the end of the day, I think, and he's Jewish, of course, as well. But I want to put this into maybe a little bit of a weird question, this comment. Where is German provincialism in all of this? Because what we are dealing with is the big metropolises, Paris and London, that has been mentioned as well. And Vienna could be also in that range. But Dresden, Leipzig, Berlin, and also I want to add something else. So Rienzi at the beginning was received very well, also in Germany. It was played at a lot of theaters, but like the criticism was like eclecticism, actually. You know, so that Wagner would have taken everything from everywhere. So the German perception was very negatively. That was meant negatively. It was not called cosmopolitic.
I would turn the question upside down. There is a lot of cosmopolitanism and any kind of national culture, and also in the later operas, only that they come in disguise through the way Wagner tries to treat them in his later work. And I would also claim there is no such thing as German musical theatre provincialism. It's just how the Germans looked at themselves. I mean, I know this is a bit challenging, but I think it's about, what I want to say, it's about discourses. And the discourses often seem to more or less put the facts in a more shadowy place. So I would say all nationalist artworks, music, literature, whatever, are always a result of cosmopolitan practices and cosmopolitan behavior at any time. That's one thing. And I'm not so sure that German musicians and German composers coming from the provinces would have been accepted into London, into Paris, into Vienna, into Budapest, if they had been as provincial as some of the people of their time would have dubbed them. So I would question this stigma of provincialism and the kind of extremes which seem to come up if you look at music or the development of music and theatre in the 19th century. But as I said, I'm no specialist, so other people might have more differentiated answers.
Just one quick answer. I think Wagner in some degrees was probably too provincial. He could have gone on after his not success of Rienzi in Paris. That's one answer. And the other one is provincialism is also just like taken from the fact that performances of Meyerbeer operas in German theaters never, of course, reached the quality of the Paris opera. That's also like one aspect I was referring to.
Thomas Habagatsky. I think we should not forget why we are here. So actually it was one reason for Wagner to come to this town, to Bayreuth, because he wanted to avoid the cosmopolitanist audiences. So not Munich, not London, not Paris. That was a key point for his motivation to come to Bayreuth. He was in search of a small city, no cosmopolitan audiences, no cosmopolitan, maybe also reception. And I think we should not forget this, that this was at the very beginning of the Bayreuth, the search for a small town, as he said, as Weimar, and so he comes to Bayreuth finally. So just to add this fact. But I entirely agree on your last point. There is no nationalism without the concept of cosmopolitanism before. And I would stress this point in particular for the opera culture in the 19th century. I think the Tannhäuser case is a case, but it is not actually a special case. There are a lot of operas transferring from France to London, and I'm not quite sure whether, in particular in this special situation of transition opera, this opera transition in the French culture from the mid-19th century when the most important operas were transferred to London, whether the London audience were asking on any national aspect in these operas. So I would be careful. I would not like to weaken Sika Döring's point on the Tannhäuser, but I think we would be careful to look to search now on these nationalist aspects within a real European transfer, as or what we say, a sort of Drehscheibe, where Paris is one point, where London is another point, where Dresden is another point. I think, I would not say music is special, but maybe opera is, I think it's the real international or the European art in 19th century. I just want to add this because the mechanism of the opera, I would not say marketing, but of the operatic world are special ones. Yeah, maybe not to compare with literature or with painting, art, and so on. So that I think I would be careful to examine now or to search the national aspects in these works. On the other hand, you are absolutely right. That is the problem of discourse, of reception, and so on. Yeah.
There's no contradiction. The interesting thing is, and that's why I tried not to talk about ideologies, but about discourses and practices and mentalities. The reception of opera, you're perfectly right, in the 19th century, and you know this much better than I do, is in a way cosmopolitan. At the same time, you might have discourses on operas, German operas in Paris, in London, that might have a nationalist overtone at some stage. So it's interesting to see that people in Europe and outside Europe, in America or the Americas, can consume a national German opera without having any difficulties, while simultaneously, more or less in a different article, in a different context, despising of national German culture and of Wagner himself. That goes hand in hand, and I think that is part of this strange intertwining of nationalism, cosmopolitanism, I think not only in the late 19th century.
So, are there any questions in South Carolina?
I had wanted to add one point to the whole province versus metropolis issue. I would actually use the word metropolis rather than cosmopolitan. It's a question also of resources. It would have been hard to match the resources of Paris in any single location in Germany, and I think that's one of the reasons for this distinction between German provincialism and Parisian cosmopolitanism. My question, however, has to do with Tristan in particular, that Susanne describes as being a German opera. And I'm wondering, I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just wondering why you describe it as a German opera, or why we think of it as a German opera, since the word German or Germany never appears in the libretto.
Through the reception of the opera and how it's received today, that we would call it a German national opera. But in the first place, it's not, and it's never mentioned, as you say, in the libretto to be any such thing. But it's part, I would say, of an entire set of Wagner operas who would have been, to whom you would have attributed the, would point it at it as a German opera, but it's not meant to be one in the first place, or it's not central to the opera in the first place. I think it's, and you would know much better than I do, and musicologists would know better than I do, but it's, if you started this entangling the foreign elements in all Wagner operas, I would be curious to know with how many German elements you would end up in the end. I'm not sure whether this has been undertaken at some stage. I think for certain operas yet, but not for the entire work, as far as I know.
Okay, any other questions here in the audience, Bayreuth? We have a couple of minutes left. No, last question, please.
How can we relate your talk and these two ideas or conceptions to nowadays? So what is like the kind of the bridge to what we discussed the last time and and 2 weeks ago, globalism or global world? I mean, this is a huge topic, I understand, but maybe to wrap up that session with a short answer.
So it would be that we should not make of cosmopolitanism and global societies as much of an ideology as nationalism might have been in other periods. Coming back to what Sylvia Meyer said, we have to be careful not to favor certain ideas or ideologies, and we always have to be careful and look at how what the effects on other peoples and I mean peoples in different continents and different social strata are. I think our job as researchers is really to have differentiated and close looks and disentangle mechanisms that might be very harmful for societies and people at large. So I think there is some kind of danger of putting the global society, globalization, and some forms of cosmopolitanism far too much in focus, and forgetting about the fact that cosmopolitanism is not only a class thing, but it's also something that Western societies might impose on other societies, to which they react with nationalisms, extremisms of different kinds. So I think there is some danger as well.
Okay, I think we are at the end of our lecture today. Thank you very much, Susanne Lachenicht, for this very rich paper. And thanks for a really lively discussion today. And we see us next week. And I think this is Eva Rieger and Gender in Wagner. So thanks very much and see you next week. Thank you.